Good afternoon, and welcome to Broward County's Asbestos Webinar presented by the AIR program. Our licensing and compliance team is looking forward to providing you with an informative session. Please find our contact information on the bottom right corner and make a note of it before we get started. So again, welcome to this webinar where we will give you a better understanding about asbestos risks, regulations, and remediation. My name is Ashley Robbins. Thank you for joining us today to talk about asbestos concerns, including public health and safety. Asbestos is a naturally occurring mineral known for its durability and heat resistance. Due to these properties, it was and continues to be used in construction and manufacturing. However, exposure to asbestos can lead to serious health issues, including lung cancer, mesothelioma, and asbestosis. In recent years, awareness of these risks continues to grow, prompting stricter regulations and a growing need for effective remediation strategies. So today, we'll talk about asbestos use in Broward County, as well as the current regulations governing its management. We'll also discuss best practices for identifying and safely handling for identifying and safely handling asbestos in various environments. Whether you're a homeowner, a contractor, a safety professional, this applies to you. We have subject matter experts who will share their insights and answer your questions. So I encourage you to engage with us throughout the session to increase your understanding and ensure a safer environment for all. All right, so a couple little housekeeping things before we get started. In order to make this webinar go as smoothly as possible, you're all automatically muted with a couple exceptions, and your cameras are automatically off. If you have a question, please feel free to use the raise hand function in Teams, and we will unmute you so that you can ask your question, or you can type your question into the chat at any point during the presentation. Since there are quite a few of you, I apologize if it takes us a while to notice your raised hand, but again, you can always try the chat. That being said, we are allowing for a Q&A portion at the end of each section to address questions that are pertinent to that specific portion of the webinar. Prior to that, Stephen, our environmental project coordinator for asbestos, will present about permits and permitting, followed by Jeff Falkinger, I apologize if I mispronounced that, from Asbestos Consulting Services, and then Khalil, our natural resources specialist, also under the air licensing and compliance group, like Stephen, our first presenter. And then Khalil, he'll focus on, he'll present on how to stay in compliance regarding demolition and renovation inspections. Lastly, we'll hear from Tracy and Boyle from the AirQuest Environmental Inc. Before we get into the final Q&A portion at the end of the webinar for any other questions on whichever portion you have inquiries about. If you feel like you missed something at any point during this webinar, no need to worry. The entire webinar will be recorded and made available eventually via our website. We can send out those links directly when it is ready. And lastly, for those of you in attendance, these slides can also be sent out, if not this week, then next week at the latest. All right, I promise you're almost done hearing me talk. Before we get to the information you've all been waiting for, we wanted to provide a brief overview of what each of our three sections do within the AIR program. So there's ambient air monitoring. They monitor for air quality, more specifically, right, for outdoor air pollutants. Data is gathered from our 6 air monitoring stations that we have across the county to update information about our air quality, and specifically from the Air Quality Index, thus keeping the public informed. And after that data is collected, it's sent to the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDP. Then we have outreach. That is my wheelhouse. It's another word for community engagement. So my team and I talk to Broward residents about air quality, climate change, and other environmental topics relating to air. Licensing and compliance, last but not least, the individuals who will be presenting to you today, ensure that entities that acquire and maintain air licenses and permits follow the rules or stay in compliance right throughout all of Broward County, which of course is why you're here today. So without further ado, our first speaker is Stephen, who will kick things off. And again, thank you all for being here today.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I did have a first question already. So Clive, we are going to share the slides, as Ashley mentioned, and we will have also the presentation recorded. We are working, so you're aware, on a handout as well, a little flyer that we're going to be producing within the department, and hopefully be sharing that pretty soon as well. So welcome, everyone. My name is Steve Bedoya. I'm the Environmental Project Coordinator for Asbestos. Essentially, I've been here for a couple years with Broward, but I have a past life working elsewhere with asbestos, so has quite a few years in regulations for the asbestos program. I work in the air licensing compliance section of Broward County, and we're here to learn about asbestos. So the main thing, whenever we talk about asbestos, normally in a in-person setting, I always ask the crowd, has anybody ever been exposed to asbestos? And normally everybody should raise their hand. It doesn't matter how much asbestos there is, any sort of exposure is still a hazard to everybody involved, whether it be a person living there, a contractor, anybody walking by could potentially be exposed to asbestos at any point in time. So just keep that in mind that it is a danger at all times. So essentially today we're going to talk about our local Broward County requirements. So we have our e-permitting process, something that's required in the Florida Building Code. So regardless of what a city asks for, regardless of what someone may tell you, no matter what you do in Broward County, you have to apply to the county. So whether you're removing a square foot, you're removing a whole wall, a whole building, whatever it is, if you're doing removal material, renovation or demolition, make sure you apply for this process. If you're not sure if you're going to have a project, you might just have a quote coming in line, apply. You don't have to pay for anything. As soon as that customer does their down payment, you have them on contract, pay for that process. But that'll cut down the review timeframes and you get ahead of it before the city asks for all these requirements afterwards. So essentially, we're going to talk about some recent changes, which actually we'll move to the end of the presentation as we do have some feedback with one of the consultants. We have frequently asked questions. We have ePermits and the ePermits one-stop system. We have creating an application, the items that will help along the way, the ePermits for commercial applications. And once your application is finished, now what? So essentially, some of you may be familiar with the program, so you may have seen this form. I have to reiterate every time, we no longer use this form. There's no actual forms to fill out. Everything is electronic. So this same system that you're talking about, e-permits, it's all been transcribed from this form into an electronic process. So if anybody hands you this form, there's no reason to complete this. This form is now fully electronic. Same things you were submitting previously, now you're going to submit through the e-permit system. So essentially, you get the transcribed form, as I mentioned. This was a long process with our ATS program, and now there's no reason to fill out anything by paper. Everything is fully electronic. You can even do it through your cell phone. So essentially, when you're going into the ePermit system, you're going to be submitting an application. After you register, of course, and you click that verification email, you're going to choose a specific statement of responsibilities. That's the permit type that we do for plan review. After you select the type, you're going to select the actual program, the facility for the site. So your project information, you're going to name the project. It gives you the step-by-step up on top, project information, location, parties, document upload, and signing the application. Halfway through the form, you may be sent to another form, which is referenced for notice of renovation or asbestos demolition. Essentially, that form is only if you have asbestos or you have demolition in terms of structural. But that form is only completed and it's sent to the state if you have a project that's regulated under the federal code. But in terms of the statement of responsibilities regarding asbestos, you're going to complete this process directly through the county website. Always make sure to complete this process all the way through until you get that confirmation number. So after you give it a project name, you're then going to select the type of facility. So the main one that we usually get, we have over 20,000 of these, is single family. With a single family, as soon as you enter the folio, you check exempt, you're pretty much fine. There's no further requirements for a single family home. The issue is when you come into commercial properties, condominiums, or residential with more than 4 dwelling units. So it could be a 5-plex, 6-plex, octaplex. You could have more than one structure at the same site. So let's say 2 single family homes next to each other or in the same block. That's now a regulated project. If it's a county property, we still review it on the county side, but we do have them send it over to the state because the state has to be aware. So you may see us requesting that submission to the state. If it's a public school, we review public schools, colleges, universities. We also review private schools. We also review unsafe structures. So if there's any orders coming in from a city, let us know ahead of time that you have an order from a city, whether it's a violation, a correction you're trying to do. Just be upfront. Tell us from the beginning. It makes it much easier for the process. If you have an emergency, Emergency projects, you have 24 hours to submit. So let's say you go into a job, there's a huge flood, a lot of damage. As soon as you find that you have something, submit it. You have 24 hours to let us know. Send us an email, give us a call. Just let us know you're out there doing something. We're going to ask for that asbestos survey if you hit the thresholds, but just make sure to notify us. That's the most important thing. And finally, if anything is being demolished for commercial purposes or by government order, even though it's a residence, it's now going to be a different use for that property. We want to make sure that we do the full review. And finally, for anything other than an actual structure, we have boilers, cooling towers, billboards, bridges, pretty much you name it, we review it. Now, a main point for the single family homes. We did, starting this year, a new automated process for the SRRA that as soon as you go into property appraiser and you see the use type code is 0101 or 0105, the review time frame has been shortened from 7 days to 7 seconds. That's what I mentioned. As soon as you enter that it's single family, you plug in the folio parcel ID and you check that it's exempt, meaning it's not being sold, it's not going to be a commercial property, there's nothing other than a person doing renovations in their own home, you're fine. As soon as you submit that application, it's an immediate approval. It's not going to be more than one single family home. It's just your single family home that you're doing work in. Same thing goes for contractors. If you know you have a single family home and potentially the city might be asking you for that certificate, get ahead of it from the beginning and be aware that no matter what you do in Broward County, you have to apply for the statement. Like I mentioned, either if it's a square foot, a whole wall, the whole building, whatever it is, just apply. That's all you have to do. So when you do select that single family residence, you're going to see the features change on that page. So you're going to enter the parcel ID folio number, like I mentioned, and you check the box. Now, if you meet that exemption, it means that you're not selling that property. There's nobody else involved, no other projects, and it's just a single family home, plain and simple. Now, of course, because we did this change from changing the review period from 7 days to 7 seconds, we did receive a NACO award for that. Essentially, this change expedited over 20,000 applications. There were over 28,952 applications to receive. 20,441 were single family exempt. So essentially, those applications are now almost an automated process where it used to take a whole week and having us review, talk to the person, make sure everything was being submitted correctly. Now it's essentially 7 seconds, almost an immediate process. So it's a huge time-saving feature that we hope to implement with some other projects that we also have. So in the works that it was a long process, it took years. Hopefully now we are able to expedite that approval process for other projects and be able to expedite your review process so we get people doing repairs and any modifications they need as soon as possible. Then it's going to ask you in the system, this is not single family anymore, but a regulated project, whether you're doing a demolition, a renovation project, etc. So essentially demolition is anything that's structural. Doesn't matter if it's a full demo, partial, a column, a tie beam. Pretty much if any of your plans show impact of any of those areas, we're going to have to ask you for a structural demolition. So the structural demolition is going to be anything that requires an asbestos survey as well as a notice of demolition. Then if you have a renovation project, essentially when you have built up roofing that's 5580 square feet or more, that's your threshold. And that's when you hit the 160 square feet. That's when the niche app. When you have exterior alterations over 160 square feet or an interior alteration that's over 160 square feet, those are the triggers that you have to see on your plans or knowing what scope you're doing as a GC to make sure that you're complying with the rules. So ahead of when you're applying, essentially when you're marking these fields, you're going to know ahead of time if you need an asbestos survey. If you're not sure, give us a call. Hey, I'm removing 12 feet of wall. I'm removing this concrete barrier. I'm removing this exterior, whatever it is, call us. Our phones don't stop ringing. Right now, it stopped ringing a little bit because obviously we're on the webinar. But essentially, we're always available. Give us an email, give us a call. We're happy to answer any questions. But just make sure to get ahead of it because and you're going to be wasting 14 days or waiting for the city to tell you what to do. Get ahead of it from the beginning. That's the main thing. And of course, like I mentioned, that page that it sends you to. So if you do require a notice, like I mentioned, it's if you have anything that's asbestos removal or structural demolition. like all those fields that I showed you previously. But the other time that we also ask for notices is if you have a legalization or an after the fact project. So you might be coming in to do a build out. We don't look at build out. Build out goes to a different group in our office. It's actually a whole separate building, and they review build out. For us, it's only demolition and renovation projects, anything for removal. So if we get a project that the city's sending you to us because it has to have our review, we're going to ask you what happened before. That's where this form comes in. All we're looking at is what was removed. That's all we need. That's all we pretty much need. That's all we look at. So whether you have plans, whether you know who did it, if only the owner knows, that's who the people that you're going to list on that form. So we can reach out to them and talk to them. But we just have to know. That's all. And essentially, that form is submitted to the state as a non-notifier because we do want to document whatever was done previously. You don't want to have something that shows up months later that we find that it was already done. Just be upfront about it. Tell us from the beginning. It makes it much easier. If you already know there's a violation with the city, just come to us and tell us. That way we know we can expedite this process for you and not have this back and forth of what happened previously. And then finally, once you finish with the application, you are signing electronically. So you sign it saying you're the owner authorized agent, and then you e-sign the application, making sure that you're the one signing off and you're agreeing to these terms. So essentially, this is all the same form that you used to fill out by hand, now fully electronic. So like I mentioned, that form that you would fill out if you had asbestos or you have structural demolition, or if you have anything that's after the fact, this is the form. All fields have to be completed to the best of your knowledge. Essentially, it does say asbestos on the form, but keep in mind this is renovation or demolition. So demolition meaning structural, renovation meaning removal of materials. So whether it's asbestos, if you have an after the fact project, just showing what was done before, that's what you would document on this form. You fill it as best as you can because essentially, if you're the new contractor coming in for build out, you're really not sure what happened before, you're going to list the owner. If only the owner knows what happened. They fill it out to the best of their knowledge. They may not know what happened along the way, but we try to gather as much information as possible as we send it. I did have a question. Kitchen and bathroom cabinets removal. So we do get a lot of projects for cabinets removal. We don't really look at the cabinets themselves. We just look for anything further that has removal, but a lot of cities do send it regardless. So we've seen everything from windows and doors, just cabinets, someone doing electrical or just mechanical. We don't really look at those projects, but if the city is requiring you to come in, you're going to need the statement. So like I mentioned, get ahead of it. If you know you're doing a project in Broward County, just apply for it. You don't even have to pay for the process. Once the city asks you, once you know you have that threshold, once you know you might need it, pay for it and get that process approved. It's pretty straightforward. You just send us the plan showing you're only doing those cabinets or you're only doing that electrical, mechanical, whatever it is, and then we approve it. Essentially, we don't need to look at it if it's just kitchen cabinets, but if you're having to go through the city and they're requiring you to come in, get ahead of it. That's my best advice. So some frequently asked questions that we get is, what's the purpose of the SRRA? Why, when did the electronic submittal of the SRRA start? Will I need to pay a fee when submitting a statement for a non-exempt project? Are all projects subject to paying the statement fee? What are the additional asbestos program requirements? And will I be able to pay online? So the statement of responsibilities regarding asbestos ensures that building permit applicants properly account for asbestos concerns and provide applicants with information about asbestos-related regulations and the handling of regulated asbestos-containing materials, which is RACM. The submittal of the SRRA via ePermit started on February 17, 2015. So we're talking about almost a decade ago. It's regulated under the Broward County Code, Section 27180B. It requires the statement to be submitted at least 10 working days before commencing work, and all submittals are done online only. So even like I said, if you have an after the fact project, doesn't matter when you started, make sure to stay ahead of it and just apply. That's all we're asking. And of course, with the fees, there is a fee for non-exempt projects. So unless you have a single family home, which is just one single home, unless you're a public school or you're a county building where it should be going to the state, you have to pay a fee. The $50 review fee has to accompany the submittal of the SRA for each non-exempt demo or rental project at a single site. Again, this Section 27180B of the Broward County Code and Section 4023 of the Broward County Administrative Code authorizes the SRRA review fee to be collected. So, like I mentioned, not all projects have the fee. So anything that's 4 or fewer dwellings, so you have a single-family home, duplex, triplex, quadplex, essentially those are not going to be required to have a fee. Those are exempt properties. But anything that has more than 4, Broward County Board of County Commissioners owned facilities also don't have any fees. And public schools, colleges, universities are also exempt from the fee. And like I mentioned, some additional requirements is that notice of demolition or asbestos renovation. So it is required to be submitted with the application. In the event you don't submit it with the application and we ask for it afterwards, you have to keep in mind that 10 working days requirement before the start of the demo or renovation project. Of course, there is an exemption with emergency projects. You have 24 hours to notify about an emergency. And of course, this applies to all demolitions and renovations of all structures, installations, buildings, excluding residential buildings that have 4 or fewer dwelling units. And additional requirements apply once you hit that threshold, that 160 square feet or the 260 linear feet or 35 cubic feet of Rackham. And of course, all payments are done online. We're not cashiers. We don't handle any money in this office. We actually used to have terminals in our old building. Here, we don't even have computers to be able to assist people. So everything is paid for electronically, online. It can be done through credit card or personal checks. And of course, all statements are done electronically through ePermits. I have a question. You can go to the next slide. I'm just reading the question. Yeah, so essentially with asbestos, as long as you don't disturb the material, there's no hazard. It depends on the material that came back positive. For example, on carpet work, I would assume it was just, let's say, the mastic or something underneath it, or it may have been some other flooring that was positive. Essentially, as long as you disturb the actual asbestos material, you can do a layover on top of it, almost like encapsulation. You don't have to actually disturb the material. You're not required to. Of course, we recommend removing it. That's going to be our first go-to, but you're not required to remove it. There's no time frames. We're talking about a material that has been around. This rule was established. The last update was back in 1990. We're 20 something years in, and there's still asbestos out there. So no one's required to remove it. The hazard comes in when you decide to remove it, and then you have to take proper precautions. The most dangerous one is Rackham, that regulated asbestos-containing material. Essentially, I would say with carpet, we will have to look at the report. If you have a question like that, I mean, we don't want to hold up a project. You can always send us a report and ask us what you would need. We're happy to answer any questions. Still filling out the form for commercial. All right, so yeah, there is a major change with roofings coming up. So that's coming up in a couple slides. So I won't break the action now. Yeah, so essentially, if it's under the carpeting, it could have been the mastic, the flooring. Like I said, as long as there's no actual removal of that material, they could do a layover on top of it. And as long as you don't disturb it, it shouldn't be a hazard for anybody that's in there. But we'll be happy to, if you can send us that survey, we'll definitely answer that question. So yeah, the roofing we'll reference in just a bit. That's part of the updates that we have. So the statement process is required regardless of the year built, like I was mentioning earlier. This regulation has been in place, the last change back in 1990, and is part of your building department's permit application process. All demolition, renovation, re-roofing permits in Broward County require the statement that's issued by the Broward County Natural Resources Division. All applications are created on ePermits.broward.org. Now, when you're creating an application, things that will help simplify the process will be the paper copy or a web page with a bcpa.net. Essentially, it's going to tell you the use of the property, the address, so you're able to match that up, and so we can find also the property easily. For example, there's our GC West office. You can see there the address of the property, so you can easily fill out your application, and you can see the code use as well. Now, when creating an application, where do I start? So the city asks you for a statement. Where do you begin? So you should have started before the city asked you. Like I mentioned, anything you do in Broward, you should be applying, but you're going to begin at ePermits.broward.org. You register for an account, you get the user ID and password, you get that verification email, and you sign in. The number of steps for your application depends on the facility type. If it's single family, as soon as you enter that folio park exempt, You enter the contacts, you're pretty much done, and you submit it, and you get the approval. If it's anything that's not single family, we might ask you for the scope of demo, reno work, a roofing job, an asbestos survey. Single family applications, like I mentioned, don't require FEER plans. However, everything else does. And of course, we do have a YouTube video that does give you a step-by-step of that process for submitting the ePermit. So essentially, the scope of work of demo and reno work must be defined and plans must be uploaded. The start date needs to be at least 14 days after your SRRA submittal date. Actual project start date must be updated later, meaning if you need to get the city permits, of course, afterwards, keep in mind those gaps between our approval and when the city approves it. And we can actually get when you can actually have your team out there starting the job. So keep in mind when you put those dates in. If you're not removing any asbestos or demolishing any load-bearing structural members, you may begin your project once you receive your building permit. This is, of course, for e-permits for commercial applications. So once you create your application, how do you know the status? When you go onto the web page, you click on My Projects, click on My Applications. You click on that application, you'll see the status. It says in review, the fee is due, or approved. Some of them will be approved, but you might have entered the wrong contact information. If you put a mailing address as an email, there's no way for us to email that process. It's going to crash the system. Just make sure you have the right contacts. If you have it in a review, you're probably in that 14-day window for the review timeframe, or you have some updates that we requested that are still pending. And of course, if the fee is due, unless you pay, we won't see it. That's why I mentioned you can always submit an application. As long as you don't pay it, we're not going to tell you to do anything. Once you pay it, it starts that review. So you can always submit when you have that proposal, when you have that contract signed, you can pay it and call us to review it. So once finished submitting an application, you pay the review fee, unless it's exempt, single-family residence. The turnaround period for projects with no outstanding fees that have been submitted, that submitted all required documents, such as plans, notifications, demo, re-roof abatement fees, and asbestos reports, is 14 days. The review application status is online, like I just showed you. It's in review, fee is due, or approved. You may see also some that are denied. Denied meaning it might be a duplicate. We already approved that project previously. Then we ask you for what's the reasoning as to why you have a duplicate. Just keep that in mind. Potentially in the future, we might be changing our code where it might have a time frame very similar to the cities, where after a certain amount of time, or let's say the year, it'll automatically deny that process. So just keep that in mind that you want to stay active on these jobs. Don't let it run for months without any updates. We just want to know what happened or what's happening so we can document it, approve it, and move on. And finally, you can view print your approved document online. So the document titled Asbestos Certificate of Submittal, there's a little button on the left. That's going to be the review button to download it. So essentially, this is what the page looks like. You click that little button on the left side. You might see an icon. You might just see a broken icon. But essentially, that's where you click to view, and it downloads this PDF copy of the certificate. So essentially, this is the approval that the city is looking for. So if you know you have a project in Broward, you know you have any removal, any demolition, just get it done. The city's gonna ask you anyway. So just make sure you have this approval certificate. So some common mistakes. Standing review fees or the impact fees associated with asbestos removal, demolition, or re-roofing. So if you don't pay, there's nothing for us to look at. Not providing plans or further documentation requested, such as the asbestos report, the notice of demolition, or asbestos renovation. If applicable, submit the scope of demo reno work and the asbestos survey. An incorrect address or address not found in property appraiser. In the case of BSO, firefighter, judge, protected identity, whatever it is, just give us a call. Just let us know so we can find that property. And finally, if you exclude the contact information, we have no way of reaching you. We have no way of updating anybody. So some key points when filling out the ePermits application to help reduce review timeframes. Projects with no demolition or renovation of existing walls, floorings, or ceiling in the scope of work don't require a statement. So if you're doing new construction, there's no reason for you to be coming to us. If for some reason the city's asking you about it, it's probably an after-the-fact project, and so whoever did it previously should be applying for that. Now, if they didn't apply, that's when you previously. As part of the review process for applications for interior renovations of residential properties with more than 4 dwelling units and commercial properties, we do ask for plans, a sketch, anything that shows us what work you're doing. That's for demo and reno work. that is required to be uploaded while completing the online application. For re-roof projects for residential properties with more than 4 dwelling units, as well as commercial properties, when filling out the online application, we do ask that you specify the size of the flat roof to be replaced and the way the roof is to be removed, whether using hand tools or power tools. And finally, we have our contact information, which you also saw in the beginning of the slide. And you can tell our numbers as to how many processes we get. Asbestos is all the way in the left. I think that was for the first quarter, and we had 7,000 compared to up to 1,000 for other programs. So we get quite a bit of volume. So there it is zoomed in, actually almost 8,000, just in one quarter. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is a change with our permitting process and the ePermitting process itself. So there's been an uptick in the number of legalizations in various cities. This is not something that just happened overnight. We've been seeing an uptick pretty much of whether we got an after the fact maybe once or twice a year for non-notifier. Now it's increased to maybe 1 or 2 a week. So we have a lot of violations out there. This is nothing new. Before the building codes had this requirement for years, our local requirements have been in place for quite a number of years. There's no reason no one should be aware of this. It's under the Florida Building Code. If you have a contractor that's licensed, they should be knowing what they're doing. They should know they have to apply for the statement, and they should know the city's going to be asking for it. And we're finding out about these projects afterwards. So, and of course, there are a lot of repeat violators as well. We try to give them the benefit of the doubt, make sure you do the right thing, but then we're finding that they submit again for another after the fact. This is happening way too much. Work should not be done prior to issuance of the statement responsibilities certificate. We're requesting a non-notifier notice of demolition or a special renovation. We have to document what happened previously, and we are pursuing cases under regulated enforcement. So don't be surprised if you get a violation for a project that was after the fact. It's happening way too much. That's an issue for us. Also, we are getting a lot of projects now with roofing that are also in violation. So essentially with roofing projects, all regulated re-roof projects that are 5580 square feet or more require an asbestos survey. The reason for that is under our local code, we require the notice and we require a survey. That goes for any project. But once you hit that 5580 square feet or more threshold for roofing, that's when you know you hit the 160. We're requiring asbestos surveys for those projects. Reason being, a lot of contractors are saying they're using wet method on the roof. That's not realistic. Obviously, if you use wet method on the roof, you're going to fall off the roof. So, but they're saying that in the forms. Once they submit the project and we go and do the inspection, they're just tossing the material off the roof. When that material hits the ground, you may not have caused it to be rackham on the roof and you're assuming it to be positive material. Now you're causing the asbestos waste handling processes to be in violation. Once you chuck it off the roof, there's no chutes, there's no containment. You're creating this dust cloud that's traveling to a property nearby, next door, and causing a nuisance. This is a big issue. Now, if it's not on the roof, if it's not on the waste disposal trailer, what's happening now also is we inspected the landfills and the materials are becoming friable. Pretty much they're being broken up at the landfills, and these poor employees have no idea what's happening. So essentially, everybody's getting exposed to asbestos, potentially at the job site, at a neighboring property, or at the landfill, and people are coming in with violations even for roofing projects at this point in time. So now we're requiring anything that's 5580 square feet or more to have an asbestos survey. So essentially, this is a local requirement. We invited the whole state to this presentation. We invited pretty much every single contractor we had a contact for, also locally in the Broward County, that do renovations, demos, roofings. Be aware that if you have 5580 square feet or more, it will require an asbestos survey. Reason for that is we have an uptick in violations. We have a lot of handling mispractices happening, whether it's on site or at the landfill, and we cannot have people being exposed to asbestos. Do you have a question? So no, in terms of shingles, we don't we're talking about built-up roofing only. So if you have built-up flat roofing, that's where the 5580 square feet threshold comes in. So I probably should update this slide. So I should specify that it's regulated flat re-roof projects that are 5580 square feet or more. Okay.
Yeah, and Stephen, later on in the presentation, I have a slide that shows why roofing projects are definitely more complicated when it comes to other projects. So we can elaborate on that later on in the presentation.
Yeah. So and essentially, when you were filling out that form previously as a contractor for roofing, you were assuming that you're going to take proper practices, assuming that you're going to be able to handle the material correctly, and assuming you were taking it to an asbestos landfill and labeling things correctly. The problem is that when it makes it to the landfill, even at the site, when you have and people are potentially being exposed. A lot of roofers tell us, oh, but there's no asbestos. The only way you can guarantee there's no asbestos is with an asbestos survey. That's it. There's no way around it. So unless you have an asbestos survey that tells you no asbestos, you are assuming it to be asbestos. And even so, people are not taking the proper precautions. So that's why we're implementing this for anything that's 5580 square feet or more, a flat roof. Now, in terms of the after the facts and in terms of when a survey is required, essentially for after the facts, if you have a non-notifier notice submitted, we're going to be asking you what happened previously, and we're also going to be asking for an asbestos survey. Do you have a question? So facilities with less than 55. Yeah, so the 5580 square feet of flat roof, that's the threshold for the 160 square feet for requiring an asbestos survey. So anything below 5580, we're now requiring the asbestos survey. So essentially, that's just a courtesy project. As long as it doesn't reach the 5580 square feet threshold, we're now requiring that. Of course, you may ask essentially, oh, but that material could still have asbestos. Agreed, it could still have asbestos, but our threshold is still the 5580 that reaches the 160 square feet based on the cuts. Hopefully that answers the question. So like I was mentioning, the non-notifier notice, we're going to ask you what happened previously for after the fact projects, essentially who did the removal, what they did, and we're still going to ask you for that asbestos survey because a lot of people are coming in and saying, oh, well, we removed it, it didn't have any asbestos. Unless you have a test that shows otherwise, you have to have the asbestos survey done. So we're asking for surveys for non-notifiers as well. The only way you know if there's no asbestos is with a test. A consultant has to clear that. Also, when it comes to roofing projects, now you know 5580 square feet or more, you're going to have the asbestos survey requirement. Also, if you have that 160 threshold on any project, renovation, or a full demolition, you're going to require that asbestos survey. Now, we do have some feedback. Obviously, this is a surprising news tidbit for also the consultants as they weren't aware. And we do have a consultant on the line in case he has some war stories to share because he is familiar with after the fact projects and has some experience dealing with some customers that he's dealt with.
And Stephen, I think Tomorrow had a question too, but I think you answered it.
Oh, sorry. So it appears all the same procedures for commercial roofing, but asbestos. Yeah, so it's the same procedures as before. Essentially, the asbestos survey is required for 5580 square feet or more. In the event that you do have asbestos on site, we are going to ask for that notice as well, because if you do have asbestos that shows up on the report, we have to know how you're going to be handling that asbestos waste that's positive. So remember, 5580 square feet or more flat roof, you'll need the survey. If you do find asbestos in that survey, we're going to need the notice just to know what you're doing with that asbestos. All right, so there's our contact. So yeah, if our consultants have any feedback at all, they can go ahead and jump in at any point in time. But this concludes my presentation. And next up is Khalil, who does have his inspection findings. That he's going to share in a bit.
Hi, how are you? My name's Khalil Jackson. I'm also a natural resources specialist with Broward County's NRD division, working in the air program and air licensing compliance and asbestos. I focus primarily on inspecting the projects that do require the notification, but I also am involved with the review of processes and will go over the common areas people fall out of compliance, whether it be paper violations or actual procedural violations at site. Sean said, so can the positive ACM roofing go to a regular landfill? So all asbestos containing waste has to go to a designated class 1 or class 3 landfill, which is the purpose of why we review these notices in the SRRA application process, because we do make sure that the landfill that is designated on that notice is a Class 1 or Class 3 landfill. So yes, this presentation will be how to ensure you stay in compliance. And I think I can go to the next slide. So a common question is, when do these inspections happen? So with the asbestos program, it's different versus the city, where you may have to schedule an inspection to start the job, to finish the job, to clear the job. Broward County asbestos inspections are done randomly. And the whole point of it being done randomly is because, obviously, if you know an inspector is coming, you're going to be doing everything to the correct regulations. It's done randomly to ensure that proper work practices are being done, regardless if an inspection happens. Because like Stephen said, we did receive over 28,000 applications a year for Broward County, as we do review every single demolition and renovation project. So there is a chance you may not get an inspection, but there also is. So it's important to know that just because you don't have an asbestos inspection doesn't mean you have to wait for one. You don't need it to start, and you don't need it to finish. One question from Anthony: as a plans reviewer, is there a minimum request? Not clear. So as a plan reviewer, if you get any sort of plans that show removal of anything, like Stephen said, even if they're removing 1 square foot of flooring, it's removal of materials, and you need to have them get the statement of responsibilities regarding asbestos for us to review and determine that it meets local, state, and federal guidelines for NESHAP. So back to the inspection. So important part is that inspections are not done to catch an issue. We definitely don't do it to catch you red-handed, because all you guys are licensed contractors. You had to pass that test. It's not an easy one, and you know what you're doing. But there are common areas where you may slip up, and we're here to make sure those common areas of non-compliance are known and they're made aware of the issue, because it's done to protect human health and the environment. And before we go to the next slide, I forgot to mention, often during Broward County inspections, we go based on the notice of demolition or asbestos renovation estimated start and finish dates. Often you can't start until you have your building permit, so the dates may not be accurate. But given that many people apply to us first, when I do inspect, typically people are not on site because they don't have the permit. So just know, if you have a notice logged with the county, the importance of the owner and contractor contacts, because we will contact you to figure out what's the status of the job, if it's started, if it's finished, if you're waiting on city permits. And if you haven't started, we will ask for a updated notification to be uploaded to your statement of responsibilities application, so that we can update the state with the revised notice to make sure things are well accounted for. And it's also required to do that update with the dates or any other information that needs to be fixed pursuant to NESHAP, the National Emission Standards for hazardous air pollutants. So the next slide. So like I said, these inspections are done to ensure compliance with our Broward County Code, Chapter 27, Section 180, which is supplemented by NESHAP. It applies to all projects involving removal of asbestos-containing material, partial or total building demolitions, or building renovation projects. And this is a really powerful section because this is what makes Broward County more strict, per se, versus the rest of Florida. We're the only county who has this application process to ensure compliance with asbestos regulations. Meaning, if you do not have the certificate, you don't have county approval to do the job. A common area of non-compliance is when they asbestos contractors, demolition contractors do begin the job because they did send in the notice and did provide us 10 working days. Just because you sent it doesn't mean you have the certificate. The good rule of thumb is just check your files. If you have our certificate for your project, you're good to go with the county. So all demolition, all renovations, and all asbestos abatement projects needs the certificate of submittal prior to starting the work. Even if there's no structural demolition or asbestos is not found, you still need the certificate to be in compliance with this section of the county code. So basically on this slide, I put the constitution of the asbestos program. This is what we follow when it comes to compliance. And in the red box, I indicated the 2 sections of the code that are the most common violations that people do receive. General contractors, roofing contractors, um, asbestos contractors, and owners. They often will get cited for this code section for a violation. And the common theme behind almost every situation is because work was done prior to issuance of the certificate. And it's important not to start before you get the certificate because if you start and we didn't get all the documents we need, whether it be an asbestos survey, notification, didn't get the applicable fees, it means that we haven't cleared the project. There were questions that we needed answered. And if we're left hanging, it's just out in the open, which is why Stephen was referencing potentially a code change to allow a window of age with applications. So basic questions on my mind when I come to a site, there's 3 sections. There's a different set of questions when it comes to demolition projects, a different set of questions when it comes to renovation projects involving asbestos, and for the time being, roofing projects over 5580 that have no asbestos survey. But we'll shortly go over the roofing part as we're planning on only requiring surveys for them. So for demolition projects, it's important to know that the asbestos program does regulate demolition. Often when I'm on site, they'll tell me there is no asbestos, and I'll talk to the site supervisor and I'll say, of course, yes, I know, but we work in the air licensing and compliance section. So if I'm there, it's just to be sure that the proper work methods are being used to prevent unconfined excessive emissions of particulate matter. So dust. Um, when I go to demolition projects, I'm asking, okay, does the facility have asbestos? If it did, has it been abated? I'm asking, will I see something that that was not mentioned in the asbestos survey by the asbestos consultant, which I have encountered before? Um, are the work practices that are given to us in the notice, are they there? Where are the signs of them being there? And water. Water is very important and it's actually required for all demolitions to prevent unconfined emissions of particulate matter, among other things, other engineering controls. And for asbestos renovation projects, these projects are, I have a lot more questions versus a demolition project. I ask, are people actively abating? How can I tell that they're there? I shouldn't come to a site and have to guess where the asbestos abatement's going. There should be signs warning the public, hey, there's asbestos here, people are abating it, and you should steer away from it while they do their job. What penalties are issued if you're in violation? So the penalties, that is up to Broward County regulated enforcement. For us as inspectors, our job is to bring the facts of what we found to them, and penalties can be per se small versus very, very substantial. And a lot of factors come into it, whether it's a repeat violator, whether the violation was deemed malicious, because there are mistakes happen. But they compute it. They have many factors that they put into the computation of a violation fine, if that answered your question. But it can be substantial. We do have histories of violations having fines in the tens of thousands of dollars, but that's on the extreme side versus violations with fines of around $1,000. Yes, I think Marta raised her hand.
I just temporarily unmuted you, Marta, if you want to try and ask your question. Oh. I think we're good, Khalil.
Okay. So yeah, violations can vary. Again, water, how can I tell they've been using adequate amounts and containment? How can I tell the contractor has done everything in their ability to keep the asbestos in their area of containment? Because once it's in the air, it could have, if it's not contained, if there's no negative air, there's no system working efficiently. If it's in a regulated facility, other people should not be affected by that work. And I wanted to highlight the word of adequate. Adequate is a very subjective word. So I put in a definition of what does adequately wet mean. So basically, you know you're using enough water if you don't see any visible emissions. Just because you don't see visible emissions, though, doesn't mean it's adequate enough. And you can see how subjective it can be. But important is it's better that it's more wet than not as wet. That's the rule of thumb you should think. And then, of course, I come into the inspections with the mentality of revisions will likely be needed because, like I said, oftentimes I go to sites, they're not there. We will contact the contractor, owner, any related party to figure out what's going on and to update the notice that we received. And then also both demolition and asbestos renovation projects. I'm going to ask, do you have the certificate? Because at the end of the day, the certificate is your clearance to do the job, of course, with your building permit. And this is the page that someone had a question about roofing, and this page kind of it definitely sums up why we're heading towards the asbestos survey for flat re-roofs. Because with asbestos roofing projects, there's a lot of leeway to meet the NESHAP regulations. Because of the leeway, that's why we were allowing flat build-up roofing greater than 5580 to just give us a notice with no asbestos survey. Because the type of material of asbestos that is affected, it's very hard to get into the air, made friable, meaning put into the air after being grinded down. And we'll later on in the presentation talk about the types of asbestos. But in the case of when I still have and will be inspecting roofing jobs, I'll ask, are they removing it in a controlled manner? Are only hand tools being used? And is the roofing material in the waste disposal site, the dumpster, observed to be non-friable? So because we're not going to be accepting notices for flat re-roofs without an asbestos survey, if there is no asbestos, we can go to the next slide. And if you have any questions, you can ask me. And Jamie brought up a good point. In violations to NESHAP, the fines are substantial as asbestos is a hazardous material. So 10,000 per day per violation. That is definitely on the table, depending on the nature of the violation. So when you're going through the ePermits application, there are two things to know: that you may have a asbestos inspection, after you get your certificate of submittal. So if you select any of these options for demolition, you should know once you get the certificate, a Broward County inspector may come by randomly for the site inspection. And of course, these are for all facilities that are not single family exempt. Even the facilities that are exempt from the fees, so public schools, Broward County owned and operated facilities, they may be exempt from the fees, but they're not exempt from the inspection. And then, of course, when regulated asbestos containing materials are to be abated, and we'll talk about what makes ACM regulated. So yeah, like Stephen was hinting at, we often look at the surveys because it depends on the material that is asbestos containing material. It just because the survey shows asbestos doesn't mean it has to be removed or doesn't mean it has to go through the 10-day notification process. But we'll do a crash course on when you need to fill out that notice. So like Stephen was saying, friable asbestos containing material is the most dangerous because if it's getting into the air, you can breathe it in. If it's getting into the air, depositing into waterways, and it's ingested, those are routes of entry that cause the negative health outcomes of diseases like asbestosis, lung cancer, um, and other preventable diseases because of this hazardous material. So by definition, friable or ACM is any material with more than 1% asbestos that when dry, it can be easily reduced to powder. So a common friable ACM that is almost it's everywhere is popcorn sealing treatments, spray applied textures, things that you can pulverize with hand pressure. That's friable and that's dangerous. So if it's over 160 square feet, 260 linear feet, so that's mainly with piping. So if you have an asbestos pipe and or insulation wrapped around a pipe that's in poor condition, that's the 260 linear feet, or caulking, window caulking. It's measured by linear feet, or 35 cubic feet of off facility components. And off facility components means if the material is off the facility, if it's in a pile, you would measure it by cubic feet. What about chipping out floor tile with the spud bar? If we go to the next slide, I can actually answer his question with that one. So the other type of asbestos is non-friable asbestos containing material, and they divide it into two categories, category 1 and category 2. So this type of asbestos containing material is, like you said, like resilient floor coverings. That would be tile, asphalt roofing products, packing, and gaskets. Those are the category 1 asbestos containing material. And those would become friable when subject to sanding, grinding, cutting, and abrading. So if you're chipping out the floor tile, you may think you're fine because at glance, it's not rackham. You don't have to abate it. But when you subject that floor tile to forces that make it friable, it is rackham. This is why asbestos contractors often are contracted to remove resilient flooring, floor tiles, because during a standard renovation, most contractors will do, like you said, chip the floor tile to remove it. But that makes the material friable and easy to get into the air. That's when it would be needed to be abated. And then you have the category 2 ACM. And the category 2 ACM, it's more of an envelope. So anything that was not what I said, the floor coverings, asphalt roofing products, packing, and gaskets, if it has asbestos in it, it would be Cat 2 ACM. But can you demolish a building with ACM and it is not considered rackham for category 1? So if you're going to demolish a building and it has Cat 1 material in it, it needs to be abated because it's going to be subject to the same previous things, sanding, grinding, cutting, abrading, or like Cat 2 has a high probability of becoming crumbled, pulverized, or reduced to powder. Because when you have a bulldozer knocking down the building, even asbestos that's locked into a tile, if that's happening, it's going to become friable and it's going to contaminate the rest of the material in the building with asbestos, and it should not be in the building if it's going to be demolished. Just like friable ACM, it would need to exceed the NESHAP quantities of 160 square feet, 260 linear feet, or 35 cubic feet of off-facility components to trigger the notification requirement in your SRRA application. All right, so to make it more interesting, so it's not like a textbook, because all this information you can find online. I figured to show you guys actual inspections. So I wanted to start off with demolition site inspections. This case is partial structural demolition. So we reviewed the plans. They were removing the canopy and some columns. One column being removed triggers that notice. Trusses being removed triggers the notice. And you can see it in the photos. You can see the roof trusses of that canopy exposed, and they were removing it. This is why we set up and required the notice. And when I come to the site, with demolition site inspections, it's pretty straightforward. We're just looking for the engineering controls used to make sure that if there is any particulate matter, it's not excessive, because this building is located in a commercial plaza. If any of this dust is affecting the neighboring buildings, it's a nuisance and would be a violation. So in order for this demolition contract to know he'll pass the asbestos inspection, they use shoring to make sure that the structural components they were removing would not compromise the stability of the rest of the building. And this goes back to what Steven said about how demolitions need the survey. Because if a column is removed improperly and the building falls down, we need to know if that building did have asbestos in it. Because, like I said, if it did and the cloud of dust is coming out from that, it highlights the need of making sure there's no asbestos in it in the first place. And also, in every demolition site inspection, there should be silt fencing, not only to keep the public out, but to help prevent any excessive particulate matter from leaving the site. So it's another control method to pass the inspection. And with this case, they had their certificate issued. They were on site during the estimated days they were going to be there. I didn't have to call them to adjust their notification because they were working according to the work methods in their notice. So this one is a total demolition site inspection, and the trend is I'm going to show you compliant inspections and non-compliant inspections so you can see the difference. This was a total demolition of a commercial facility. They had a survey, a pre-demolition asbestos survey, to indicate the presence and or absence of asbestos, and there was no asbestos detected. Um, Immediately when you come to the site, the inspector will look for evidence of water being used. Because like I've emphasized, for demolitions, wet method needs to be used. So you can see in the smaller of the red boxes, I can see that there's water on the floor. So it's going to, I'm like, okay, the water must be over there. I'll walk around. I see they have silt fencing, and then I'll just peek through the fence, and I can see the hose, and I can see the water, and I can see that they're actively using it while demolishing it. That's the goldening the scene as an inspector. It's the thing that makes me happiest. And obviously they were using water, silt fencing was up, there's no excessive particulate matter emissions, and they passed the inspection. It's in compliance. Now, this is a case of a non-compliant demolition site inspection. So, a fun fact that this building did have asbestos in it. However, we do make people get statement of responsibilities, certificate of submittals based on the scope they do. So there was an asbestos contractor who obtained their own certificate approval, abated the asbestos containing floor tiles, the category 1 ACM, prior to demolition. However, this demolition, even though there was no asbestos, was out of compliance because you can see the difference in the green box, the air that's not overloaded with particulate matter versus the air in the red box, which is clearly foggy, meaning they're not using enough water. And it's extending over the site and it's unconfined. So a rule of thumb for demolition contractors is if there are any excessive dust coming from the site, you need to use water. And if it's affecting other properties, you need to make sure to do what you can to minimize it. And this one is a random inspection, more than random. It was not planned during that day, but I was driving through the boulevard. I thought maybe it was just some fog, and I looked to my left, and there's a total demolition of a building, and I'm driving through the dust. That is non-compliance. And then in this slide, I just tell you how we can tell it's too much particulate matter in the air. If it's looking foggy, it means the light is scattering due to the excessive aerosol load in the sky. And yeah, is very easy to tell that they were not using enough water. In the next slide. However, there are ways, like we're not trying to find the violation and then fine you. Like there's a lot that goes into it. It is a violation. However, working with the inspector really does help your case. I had to go speak with the site supervisor, tell him that the amount of dust was unacceptable, and I asked him, did he receive any complaints? And that was his first question. Did you get a complaint? It should not be where you get a complaint to do something about it. You, as the contractor, should know, regardless of if you could get a complaint, if you see that, do what you need to do to mitigate it again. So right after being on site and speaking with them, they quickly used their water method that they should have been using for the demolition. It was used right after I spoke with the site supervisor and the contractor. And you could see the difference after they started spraying down the material and when they were demolishing, the dust ended up settling. So since I observed the corrective action on site within 15 minutes of being there, we can remedy the violation because it still is one as compliance without formal enforcement action. Doing this both logs the violation, but it doesn't go through the whole notice of violation route. However, this is the part I was talking about how regulator enforcement looks at trends. In the case that the same contractor or same owner has another case of this happening, we will not do compliance without formal enforcement action. They were made aware of what is expected, and if it happens again, we will go to a full violation. But it is up to the discretion of the inspector. But since the corrective action was observed as soon as possible, and they were made aware, and of the fact that everything has a history when we log it with the state, as Stephen was saying, we sent all of our notices as the local program to the Florida Department of Environmental Protection so that they know about it. And it's a database. We can go back decades in projects. In the next slide. So now we're getting to the asbestos renovation inspections. So this one, like I said, was abatement of category 1 ACM. It was floor tiles. It had 2 to 10% asbestos content in both the tile and black mastic. It was over 160 square feet, and it wasn't a single family exempt home. We knew the certificate was issued because that's why I went to inspect. They got their approval. And this is a case of, figuring it out as you work, because there are places that the contractors need to abate that may not be the easiest to do. For instance, this location of abatement, the facility was functional. People were in the building working, but they were still abating. So what you can see in figure 1, their asbestos danger signage is posted in clear view, as this was a common area, meaning people knew to stay away from it if these tubes didn't tell you anything else. We'll look into signs of if negative air is being used. So in box 2, you see the 6 mil polyurethane plastic barriers blowing inward. If it's blowing inward, it means negative air is being used because the air is going in one direction and out the other. And you can trace the unidirectional flow of the air in 3 and 4. This one, it was a really cool inspection. I liked it. I give props to this contractor. So they had the air flowing out through one exit point, and it was clean air going out through one exit point after it went through a HEPA filter. And the HEPA filter makes sure that the asbestos fibers, if there is any, because they're also using wet method to put those fibers down, is clean air. So like I said, asbestos danger signage was posted in clear view, visible and unobstructed. The evidence of negative air was there. You can tell the air is going in one direction and out the other. It's well contained. The plastic barriers are unbroken. If there was a hole in this plastic barrier, that is not containment. So making sure that your containment has plastic or 6 mil polyurethane that is unbroken is very important. And it's going through a designated exit point as clean air. And that's how you pass an asbestos inspection. And I wanted to shift it to apartments. So there's commercial facilities, but then there's also apartments. The apartment ones are definitely more difficult logistically for the contractors, but you still have to make sure the job is contained. So it was, again, floor tile that they were abating. It had 5% chrysotile asbestos content, over 160, and they did have the certificate. They had the danger signage posted in clear view, not obstructed. You could see the negative air, which is the barriers blowing inward. And they also put another engineering control. They put plastic wraps on the hallway because you should be fully decontaminating when you enter and exit the containment area. So these things are extra measures to make sure that if there is any residue, that it's not on the actual um, external facility where other people frequent. So an important part to know is that just because you have these plastic barriers on the floor, there should not be any visual residue on the floor. What it tells the inspector is that people were not properly decontaminating from leaving the unit, and now it's outside of the containment area, and a footprint, a residue mark, that is a visible emission. It doesn't have to be dust blowing in the air, but any evidence of what should have been staying in the unit or in the containment area outside of it counts as a visible emission, because this is a public corridor. Other people walk through it. So this is a case of a a bad inspection, an inspection that was out of compliance. It was this time the wall system, the 2% chrysotile asbestos in the white texture. Immediately when I got to the site, I had a hard time finding it, and that's not a good sign as an asbestos inspector. Eventually, I did find it because we had the notice with the location and the unit. We found the unit, but there was no sign on the door. So I was wondering, are they actually on site? When I knocked on the door, that's when I saw the danger signage. The danger signage is supposed to be posted in public view to warn the public to stay away from it. It doesn't serve a purpose if no one can see it. If you put up the danger signage in the actual unit where only the contractors can see it, I mean, that's good. Like they had the sign, but it needs to be placed in a visible area. And obviously, the second issue was there's a footprint outside the unit door, and it's white texture, and they are also abating the white texture. This is a sign that they were not decontaminating properly, and now it is outside the unit and it is a visible emission. And this would be significant non-compliance because any visible emission marked on an inspection sheet is not a minor non-compliance. It's a significant non-compliance. And on the next slide, this is I had to include this one because I know we're straying or going away from doing notices for roofs. But in the case that there is asbestos containing buildup roofing and it needs to be abated, or at least by a roofing contractor who has a competent person trained in the provisions of NESHAP, this is what an inspector will look for. As Stephen was saying, there have been a lot of inspections where I come on site and they're throwing the roofing material from the roof to the ground. You need to have a roof chute if it's especially elevated, as this contractor did. And so that's evidence of controlled removal. And then going to the waste disposal site, you can see the build-up roofing is not friable. It's in intact pieces, meaning that it was removed by hand tools in pieces, transported down the roof chute, and still in the same pieces. If it's unbroken, not friable, that's good. And this had no asbestos survey for it. They were assuming the roofing material to have asbestos. This is how it should look. So it was found in compliance. And going on to bagging material. So these are cases of the waste bagged. It should not be in trash bags. It should be in designated asbestos waste bags. It's properly wrapped as a leak-tight wrapping. You can see the asbestos danger signs on the bags. The figure 1 is it's a vinyl floor tile removed in one piece. And the contractor did their diligence to make sure not to break it and make it friable. Because if they removed it all in that one piece, it's a sign to the inspector that the fibers in there were not released. The figure 2 was exterior surfacing material. It was stucco. And it's also properly bagged, and it was in the asbestos contractor's trailer. And yeah, so if there's bags at the site, they should have the asbestos danger signage on it, or else we're going to ask, is that the asbestos waste, and why can you not tell what it is? And then negative air. So a lot of these inspections are done outside the active area of abatement. We wouldn't go and suit up, put on a respirator to go in and observe the actual abatement because it's just as easy to make sure people are abating it correctly by observing what's on the outside. Like I said, with negative air, no visible emissions outside the unit. Essentially, if you're an asbestos contractor, you want to keep what's in that unit in the unit. And that's it. As long as you have signs that you're enclosure is functioning properly. You don't have anything outside of the unit, outside of the area you're abating, and you can readily tell the inspector where their water source is or show them a source of water. You will pass the inspection. So this is how we can tell your negative air enclosure is not working efficiently or correctly. In figure 1, they have one exit point. The 6 mil polyurethane is blowing outwards, meaning that the air is going in one direction and out one exit point. However, in figure 2, this raises my eyes because if you have a negative air system, the plastic 6 mil polyurethane, they should both be blowing out. Like in the right side of figure 2. This one's blowing out the window consistently, but then for some reason on the other side, the other one's drooping down on the floor. This is telling the inspector, without even having to go into the unit, that something's going wrong with their negative air system. It's not going in one direction and out the other. So the air in this area of the unit that has the 6 mil urethane, it's not going with the rest of the abatement. So it means the fibers, if there is any, is not being controlled out through that one exit point through a HEPA filter, which would constitute a visible emission. And you do not need actual dust to mark an inspection out of compliance for visible emissions. If we see the negative air is not functioning, it will be marked as visible emissions because it tells us the fibers are not in a system designed to keep it in the unit and away from other people. And that's a crash course on what asbestos inspections for Broward County looks like and what an inspector looks for. And if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or type it in the chat and I can answer them.
Also, Stephen and or Khalil, if you guys wanted to open it up to, obviously, yes, if you guys have any questions, either raise your hand or type it in the chat, but I'm not sure if Jeff and or Tracy Ann still wanted to say their piece.
Hi, this is Tracy. I was just going to be available for questions if they were needed or to comment on anything. And the only things I wanted to, I guess, touch base on that kind of tie into some of the things that were said, but also to ask a question back to Khalil, which is the one that we always get that says, oh, I have an asbestos report. It's from 10 years ago. And it's at a shopping mall. And would Broward County accept a 10-year-old asbestos survey?
Yes, so we actually do not prefer old asbestos surveys because like since asbestos is still it can still legally be imported, if it's an old survey and it doesn't have a best management plan to associate that, we don't know what was renovated in that decade. The typical age for surveys that we use is at most a year old, and that's in accordance with building permits. If they're using documents more than a year old, it won't go through. So for us, our um, unofficial age limit is 1 year. The only exception is school surveys because of AHIRA, and they have to have a 3-year best management plan, and the survey may have been from 1980, but there is documentation of it being managed to the current day. So if it's an old survey, we will likely ask the contractor or owner to get a newer survey to be representative of what they're actually renovating.
Right, and that's consistent with what we find when we have old surveys is that when we do a resurvey of those that we will find asbestos in some cases that either wasn't found during the initial survey because the initial survey was done for a different purpose, or because there's been materials added to that location that weren't accounted for in the initial survey. And I always like to point out to the contractors, because we get the call all the time, I can't believe I have to do an asbestos survey. This building was built, you know, in 2000 or, you know, or last week. And asbestos is still legally imported in certain materials, and it can still be found. And as late as 2010, we were still seeing it on roofing products. It labeled right on the back of the roofing product that you could get at Home Depot or Lowe's that says contains asbestos. So it's still out there and it can still be used. I know that may be changing, but it's still present, and therefore it's found. When we had the Chinese drywall issues back in 2006 through like 2008, a lot of those homes had asbestos in the mastics used for mirrors and sinks and things of that nature. So there's no real date on it as far as when you're not going to see asbestos anymore. Some other things that we see on the consultant side is phase 1 environmental assessments that want to be used for, you know, niche apps purposes. And usually those are done by inspectors that aren't licensed in the state of Florida and or aren't done to meet a niche app required, you know, niche app requirements. As well as some schools trying to use SRRA inspections for niche app compliance purpose when, you know, in the SRRA, you don't have to do a thorough destructive survey. So you can't necessarily use an SRRA inspection to do a demo of a building. You have to do a niche apps level inspection. So there's different types of inspections for different purposes. There can be surveys that are limited to your particular area. If you're just going to be renovating, you know, a kitchen, or just going to be renovating a portion of a facility, you can do an asbestos survey for just that portion of the facility that will be disturbed. Keeping in mind, though, that if you go into other areas, then you're not, you know, your survey is not going to cover you. I was just looking at some of our notes as a company. I had asked everybody to filter me any questions or anything that they've seen recently. And one thing that did come up that I think is pertinent to the contractors out there is, you know, people's fear of asbestos. And even when you're handling it properly, that fear is still there, and you have to manage it appropriately. And one of the things that you can do is to be open, you know, about it with the people who are going to be possibly affected by having to change their route into their office or whatnot. Because once fear takes over, it doesn't take long these days before you'll end up with, you know, news crews on site, or in one case that AirQuest dealt with, helicopters overhead. I mean, all sorts of crazy stuff. So it's really important that you do follow asbestos regulations and that you do have a competent contractor on board with you, because once it kind of gets away from you, you really can't get it back. And asbestos is a known carcinogen, and people will react strongly if they fear that they've been exposed. I didn't have anything else. I just thought I would share those ideas with the group.
No, thank you, Tracy. And that was very informative. I see that there's a question in the chat that just came in.
The question is, do all notifications go to DEP portal? All original notifications do. There are different types of notifications. So we have original, which is the structural demolition or removal of regulated asbestos containing material. But we can also have courtesy notices. Those also go to the DEP portal. However, if locally we're asking for a courtesy notice for our end, for instance, we'll ask courtesy notices if there is regulated asbestos containing material found in the survey, but it's not going to be affected by the renovation activities. So let's say a contractor is just removing the flooring, but the survey came back positive for asbestos for the popcorn ceiling throughout the ceiling, but they're not going to remove it. We'll ask a courtesy just to protect both the contractor and everyone. So you have that notice that you're saying you're not going to affect it. And like I said, like everything's public record. If someone has a complaint, they'll ask for everything that we have, and you have that courtesy notice to protect you because you are telling them you let the county know you're not removing it and you didn't remove it. So though that would be a case where it wouldn't go to the DEP portal because it's not actual removal of asbestos containing material, but all originals go to DEP.
Thank you, Khalil. If we have any other questions, or I know Stephen mentioned earlier, if Jeff wanted to share any quote unquote war stories, either way, more than welcome.
Hey, Ashley.
Yes, this is Robert Wong, by the way, the head of the Air Licensing and Compliance Program.
Well, as long as no one else is, going to be making a statement, but one of the things that we'd like, in reference to Norman's question, we would do all of notifications, and maybe I read this wrong, but do all notifications go to DEP? Now, we would love to see folks do more notifications of, demolition or renovation. We would love to see that go more towards DEP's portal. And the reason being is this, for one thing, it's very complete in terms of the questions that it asks, and before you can move on and finalize it, you have to put everything in. Whereas when we get the PDF, mailed to us or uploaded, quite often it doesn't have all the information. Sometimes we can't even read the handwriting, and all that takes, it takes a lot of time. So it delays the whole review process. So if contractors are there, please submit it electronically. It will speed the process. And back to the question from Jaime Morales, I think, well, not a question, but a statement. I think Broward County has a civil penalty of up to 15,000. And if anybody from enforcement here to correct me, I thought it was up to 15,000 per day. And yeah, and the determination of these fees are done by the enforcement folks, and they look at things like matrices, whether something is major, moderate, or minor, what is the environmental harm, what is the extent of deviation from the requirements. So it's a pretty intense review that we go through. We get the county attorneys involved as well, to make sure that everything is legally sufficient. So that is, let me see. I think there was one other question that came up.
There was,
no,
but I believe Stephen answered
Oh,
it.
answered it? Okay.
Yeah, in the chat. And then furthermore, Tanya King from Enforcement, thank you for confirming what Robert said.
Okay, was correct. Okay, all right, good. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Robert. So yeah, just in case any of you are not viewing the chat, the question was how SRRA law applies to the laboratories that analyze asbestos samples, and Stephen put that answer in the chat. We don't regulate SRRA specifically on local rule. There's the following facility responsible for analysis of asbestos in samples collected as part of an asbestos survey shall provide documentation that it's accredited by the National Voluntary Laboratory Accreditation Program. We love our acronyms, right? And the American Industrial Hygiene Association or any other comparable national laboratory accreditation program recognized by the Resilient Environment Department for the analysis of asbestos.
Yeah, I just want to highlight that RECRA is for hazardous waste. So remember, asbestos is a hazardous material, not a hazardous waste. So there's two differences. But yeah, that's our local rule for actual sampling for the laboratories.
Thank you, Stephen, again for elaborating and for answering that question. Does anybody have anything else? And obviously, as Stephen and I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's contact info. As he said, a lot of times the phone is ringing off the hook. But these guys, I can vouch, they're all very helpful, all passionate about what they do, the whole team. So they will, you know, even though there's a lot of questions sometimes, they'll get to them when they can. And again, these slides will be made available probably before the end of this week. We'll make sure to email it out to all of you that were in attendance today. For as far as the recording, that'll take a little bit more time editing, but then whenever that recording is available, it'll be linked out from our website. And then we can also directly send that link to anybody who's interested. Thank you guys again for joining. I'll leave it up to Stephen and Khalil as far as when to call it. But again, just remember, for all of you in attendance, thank you for taking the time. I know that was a lot of information. And B, you can reach out should there be any questions that come up or that occur to you later on.
Yeah, any feedback, any questions, let us know. We can wrap it up now, and you'll have these slides and presentation available later on. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending.